Yuna had a system for rooms like this one. It had taken her years to develop it, and she was not particularly proud of it, but she was practical about it, the way she was practical about most things that had been born from necessity and had proven their worth through repetition. The system was this. She identified, upon entering any room that contained more than 20 people and a microphone, the specific cluster of individuals most likely to make her the subject of something, and she positioned herself in relation to that cluster the way a careful navigator positions a vessel in relation to a known hazard, not fleeing it, because fleeing was visible and visibility was its own liability, but maintaining a calculated distance, an angle of approach that made her accessible without being exposed, present without being a target. She had been running this system since she was 14 years old, and it had served her adequately. It had not made her happy, it had kept her intact, which she had come to understand as a different and more achievable standard. The Seoul Young Innovators Gala occupied the entire fourth floor of the Lotte World Towers event space, a room that had been designed to make everyone inside it feel simultaneously important and slightly inadequate, which was, she suspected, the architectural intention of spaces that cost this much to rent for an evening. The ceiling was glass, and the city spread beneath and around it like a circuit board lit from within, and the tables were dressed in the particular shade of white that required a certain income level to keep clean, and the guests moved through the early evening in the careful choreography of people who had been told that tonight mattered and were performing their belief in that assessment with varying degrees of conviction. Yuna moved through it with her system running, and her glass of water held at an angle that implied she was mid-thought about something important, which was the gesture that most effectively communicated, "Do not interrupt me," without requiring her to say it. She had been nominated in the social impact category. She knew what that meant. She had known it from the moment the email arrived, with its congratulations framed in the particular warmth of an institution that wanted her presence but not her prominence, that needed the category filled because the sponsors of the broader categories required the contrast, required the proof that the event was not only about the large and the loud, but also about the small and the earnest, the category that made the other categories feel more generous by existing. She was the social impact nominee. She had built her company, Jisong Community Partners, from a consulting fee she had deferred paying herself for 11 months and 2 investors who believed in the work because they had seen it in their own neighborhoods, because she had gone to those neighborhoods and done the work, and the work had been visible to people who were paying attention. She had done this for 4 years. She had not been in a room like this one for most of those 4 years, because rooms like this one had not been interested in what she was doing for most of those 4 years. And she had made her peace with that, or something that functioned like peace, which was the understanding that the work was the thing, that the work did not require the room's permission to matter. She was here now, though. She had come. She had worn the navy dress she had bought for her first major client presentation 3 years ago and had dry cleaned twice since, and which still fit because she had not changed the habit of forgetting to eat when she was deep in a project, and she had pinned her hair in the way that her assistant Su-yeon called "your serious face," which was accurate. And she had taken the subway because the taxi would have been 40 minutes, and she did not trust anything about this evening enough to spend 40 minutes in transit thinking about it. She had arrived, and she had found her table, and she had run the system. And the system had identified, immediately and with the efficiency of long practice, the primary hazard. Cha Junho was standing near the stage. He was exactly as she remembered him from the version of herself that she had spent a considerable amount of energy moving away from, which was to say, he was exactly as the world had always received him, smooth and television bright, with the particular quality of a man whose charm had been refined through 15 years of camera proximity into something that functioned in person as a slightly too intense replica of warmth. He was the kind of handsome that photographed well and was exhausting in 3 dimensions. He was holding a glass of something amber and talking to a cluster of men who laughed at intervals that suggested they were laughing at him rather than with him and had decided not to distinguish between the two. He had not seen her yet. She adjusted her angle. She recalculated the geometry of the room. The system, unfortunately, had not accounted for the seating chart.
She found this out at 8:14, when the ceremony began, and she located her assigned table and understood that the angle she had maintained all evening had been managing the wrong variable. The hazard was not only Cha Junho. The hazard was also, and more immediately, the table card that read Lee Dong-woo, which was the name of the man who had spent 3 years as her closest professional peer and who had developed, over the course of those 3 years, the particular variety of competitive undermining that was difficult to name precisely because it always wore the costume of support. He was already seated. He smiled at her with the full of his professional warmth, the warmth that said, "I am glad to see you, and also, I am glad that we are here together so that I can be visibly glad to see you in a room full of people who will note that I was glad to see you and register it to my account." She sat down. She said hello. She ran the system at reduced capacity because the system had not been designed for simultaneous bilateral hazards and she was conserving energy for the stage. She had not looked yet at the first row. She did not know why she had not looked. She was thorough. The system was thorough. First rows at events like this one were typically occupied by the major category sponsors and their guests, by the senior organizers, by the individuals whose presence at the table nearest the stage communicated something deliberate about the hierarchy of the evening. She had not looked, and she was aware that she had not looked, and she was aware that the awareness had a quality to it that she did not entirely understand, a slight pull, directional, the way a compass needle has a quality that is not quite mechanical, even though it is entirely mechanical, the way it orients without being asked. She looked at the first row. There was a man there who was not attending the gala the way the other people in the first row were attending the gala. The other people in the first row were attending the gala in the way of people who are present at an event and are performing their presence, engaging with the program, leaning toward neighbors with comments, consulting phones with the particular discretion of people who have been told that phones are impolite at events, but who have decided that their phones are more important than the instruction. The man in the first row was doing none of this. He was seated with a stillness that was not boredom and was not attention, or rather was a form of attention that had moved past the ordinary kind into something that felt more like a natural condition, the way a river is attentive to everything that moves through it without making any effort to be so. He was in a dark suit. His face was composed and angled slightly toward the stage, not toward the tables, not toward the room, toward the stage, as if he had decided that the stage was the relevant direction and had allocated his attention accordingly and was now simply waiting for the stage to justify the allocation. He was not looking at her. She was looking at him for considerably longer than the situation required. She stopped looking at him. The ceremony began. The host was Cha Junho, which she had known from the event materials and had spent no time thinking about in the weeks since the nomination arrived, because thinking about it would have been a form of anticipation that she had trained herself not to perform, anticipation being the mechanism by which disappointment achieved its maximum efficiency. She watched him take the stage with the practiced ease of a man who had taken many stages and knew how they received him. And she felt the system running at full capacity, felt it cataloging and calculating, and she told herself, the category is minor, the speech is brief, there is no version of this evening in which he focuses his attention on something as small as a social impact nominee. You are managing a risk that is not the actual risk. The actual risk is contained. The evening will end, and you will go home on the subway, and Soo-yeon will text you tomorrow and ask how it went, and you will say fine, and it will have been fine. The first hour was fine. The major categories proceeded with the rhythm of these events, which was a rhythm of controlled excitement and managed applause, and speeches that ran slightly long and were received with the particular patience of audiences that had been fed well enough to sustain tolerance. Yuna ate the salmon. She spoke to the woman on her left who worked in clean energy and who had the quality of someone genuinely interested in the thing they had built, and the conversation was real in the way that conversations at events like this one almost never were, and she allowed herself to be briefly and genuinely present in it, which was a relief. Lee Dong-woo contributed 3 observations to the table that were framed as conversation and functioned as resume points. She noted them and let them pass. At 9:40, Cha Junho returned to the stage and announced the social impact category. She heard her name. She rose. She was aware, as she moved toward the stage, of the specific quality of attention that a room gives a person walking toward a stage for a minor category, which was the quality of attention one gives a transition, something necessary but not the main event, something that fills the space between the things that matter. She was aware of it, and she placed it where she placed things she had no use for, in the outer filing cabinet of her consciousness, and she walked toward the stage with her spine straight and her expression arranged into the configuration of professional composure, and she reached the stairs, and she climbed them, and she was on the stage. Cha Junho was smiling.
She recognized the smile. She had seen it in a different context, in a different building, in a version of herself that was 16 years old and standing in a corridor at Hanguk High School and had just declined to attend a party that Cha Junho had invited her to, had declined politely but completely, had said no with the full of herself, and had watched the smile appear on his face in that corridor, and had understood immediately that the smile was not acceptance of the decline, but the registration of a debt, the opening of an account, the silent notation that this would be addressed at a time of his choosing. She had been waiting in some quiet part of herself for 21 years for the time of his choosing. She had not known that it would be here. She had not known that it would be now. She knew both things, looking at that smile in the stage lights of the Seoul Young Innovators Gala at the top of the Lotte World Tower, with the city spread below the glass ceiling like a lit circuit board and 300 people in white table-dressed seats watching. He began gently. He always began gently. That was the architecture of it. You began with something that sounded like a compliment and that had the structure of a compliment, but that contained in the negative space of it, in the thing it was saying by careful implication, the first placement of the frame. He talked about her company, about Jisong Community Partners, about the work in the neighborhoods, and he described it with the particular warmth of someone describing something charming and limited, something that one admired for its earnestness without being required to take it entirely seriously. And the room received it that way, because the room takes its cues from the person with the microphone, which is why the person with the microphone is always the most powerful person in the room, regardless of every other variable. He was warming them up. She stood beside him on the stage and felt the system running and felt it returning information she did not want and could not use, because there was nowhere to go, because the stage had exactly the dimensions of a stage, which was to say that it was an elevated platform surrounded on three sides by the expectation that you would remain on it, and the only direction that was not the stage was back to the stairs and down them, and going back down the stairs was the thing she could not do, because going back down the stairs was the version of this evening she could not survive with anything intact. He went further. He told a story. He was a gifted storyteller, which is why he had a television career, and the story was about a girl he had known in school who had always been too serious, too intense, who had not known how to relax and enjoy things, who had been, he said with the warm and self-deprecating smile that the camera had taught him to deploy at precisely this kind of moment, a little difficult to be around, a little much. He did not say her name. He did not need to say her name. He was standing next to her on a stage. He was gesturing at her with the easy familiarity of someone sharing a private memory with 300 people. The room was laughing, not unkindly, because the room thought it was sharing a moment, thought it was being let in on something affectionate, thought the laughter was the laughter of people responding to charm. She stood there. She had stood in versions of this space her entire life, the space that was created when someone with a microphone or a classroom or a dinner cable decided to make her the subject of the entertainment, and she had learned through the standing in it a thing that most people learned only abstractly, which was that the experience of public humiliation was not primarily an emotional experience in the moment of its occurrence, it was a physical one. It was the specific sensation of your body becoming visible to you in a way it was not usually visible, of becoming aware of your hands and where they were and what they were doing, and whether they were communicating something you had not intended to communicate, of your face and what it was doing, of the particular challenge of keeping your expression in the configuration of a person receiving something with grace, when what you were receiving was not something you had agreed to receive. She stood there, and she felt her hands, and she felt her face, and she breathed with the care of someone managing a physical process rather than an emotional one, because the emotional one could wait, had always waited, had a patient and extensive history of waiting for the private moment.
The laughter continued. He was in the rhythm of it now, the rhythm that belonged to people who understood they had a room, and having a room was its own momentum, and momentum did not require him to stop. He said something about her dress. He said something about the subway. He had seen her arrive then, had noticed and filed it, because the debt had always been waiting to be collected, and he had wanted the material. The room laughed again. She heard it the way you hear weather when you are inside it, from every direction simultaneously, with no angle of approach from which it was not present. She was looking at the trophy in his hand, the social impact category trophy, which was smaller than the major category trophies and made of a different material, a lighter alloy that was heavier with implication than it was with substance. She was looking at it because looking at it meant she was not looking at the room, and not looking at the room meant she was not processing the 300 individual expressions of people who were deciding what to do with what they were watching, whether to receive it as entertainment or as something else, whether the something else required them to do anything. And she knew from long experience that they were deciding in favor of the entertainment because that was the easier decision, because the person with the microphone had framed it as entertainment, and the frame was a powerful thing once it had been applied. She heard a sound. It was a small sound. A chair. The controlled movement of a chair in the first row, someone rising. And she knew before she looked, in the way she had known things tonight that she did not know how she knew, that it was him, that it was the man from the first row who had been sitting with the quality of something attentive and waiting, who had allocated his attention to the stage at the beginning of the evening and whose allocation was now being activated. She looked. He was standing. He did not move immediately. He stood and the room registered him standing the way a room registers a change in atmospheric pressure, not with noise, but with a collective internal adjustment. The slight recalibration of 300 people processing new information and rearranging their understanding of the evening around it. Cha Jun-ho had stopped speaking. This was not a decision Cha Jun-ho had made. It was something that happens to him, the way things happen when you are in the middle of saying something and the air around you changes quality and the thing you were saying becomes, in a single moment, the wrong size for the space it is trying to occupy. He stopped. He looked at the first row. He looked at the man standing in it. His face did something that Yuna had not seen his face do in 21 years of carrying the memory of it, which was to lose the smile completely, not replace it with something else, simply lose it, the way a light loses when the power goes. The man walked. He walked toward the stage the way he had been sitting in his seat, with the quality of someone for whom the physical movement of the body was simply an extension of a decision already made, unhurried, without the slight self-consciousness of someone who knows they are being watched and is managing the knowledge. He was being watched by 300 people, and the stage lights, and the glass ceiling with the city beneath it, and he walked as if none of this required his acknowledgement. He reached the stairs. He climbed them. He was on the stage. He stopped beside her. He looked at Cha Jun-ho. He did not speak. He looked with the directness of a man who had never needed to prepare the ground with words before placing the weight of his attention on a thing. And Cha Jun-ho received the look with the specific physiological response of a man who has just understood something about the evening that changes all of its preceding events retroactively, who has understood that the audience he thought he had and the audience he actually had were not the same audience, and that the difference between them was standing on the stage beside the woman he had been making into entertainment. He held out his hand for the trophy. It was such a small gesture, an extended hand, the silent indication that something should be transferred. Cha Jun-ho looked at the hand. He looked at it for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, which was the last independent decision of his evening, and then he placed the trophy in the extended hand, and the transfer happened, and the man turned to Yuna. He held the trophy out to her. She took it. The weight of it was different from what she had expected, which was to say it was heavier than it looked, the way the things you have built always weigh more than they appear to weigh from the outside. She held it, and she looked at him, and he was looking at her, with the directness she had not fully prepared herself for, with the quality of a man who saw things accurately and had no interest in seeing them any other way. He reached for the microphone. Cha Jun-ho did not resist the transfer, The microphone moved from one hand to the other with the same ease as the trophy, with the same quality of inevitability. He said, "Congratulations." His voice was low and clear and carried the hall without effort, the way voices carry when they belong to people who have never needed to raise them. He said it into the microphone, and it went everywhere, to the 300 people and the glass ceiling and the city beneath it. And it was such a simple word, and it landed with such complete weight that Una felt it in her sternum, felt it the way you feel something that has been withheld for a long time when it finally arrives, not with the relief of resolution, but with the slight shock of the unexpected. He said, "You built something with your own hands." He paused. "That is more than most of the people in this room can say."
He lowered the microphone. He turned to Cha Junho. He said, quietly, only 2 words, and he said them with the voice that did not need the microphone, the voice that had its own reach, the voice that Una was learning in real time was the actual instrument of this man's authority, not the microphone and not the stage and not the height of him, but the quality of the certainty behind every syllable. "Sit down." Cha Junho sat down. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Una counted them because she needed something to count, because her internal system, the one she had run in rooms like this one her entire life, had encountered a situation it had not been designed to process and was operating at reduced capacity, and she needed an external anchor. 4 seconds. And then the room began to move, not with applause exactly, not at first, but with the sound of people releasing something, of 300 individuals collectively exhaling something they had been holding since the laughter. And then someone in the back began to applaud, and it spread the way things spread when a room is ready for them, quickly and without resistance. She stood on the stage with the trophy in her hands and the applause around her, and the man beside her who had walked up the stairs for her, and she felt the very specific sensation of being seen, not displayed, not assessed, not made into the subject of something for the convenience of a room that needed entertainment, but seen, with the full and patient attention of someone who had allocated it to her specifically and was not looking anywhere else. Before we go any further, if this story is doing something to you right now, press like. It takes 2 seconds and it tells me you want more of this. Leave me a comment and tell me what you felt when he stood up from that first row chair. I read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, subscribe now, because the next story is already coming and you deserve to be here for it. She descended the stairs after him. She did not know where she was going. She was following, which was unusual enough to notice, because she had spent her entire adult life arranging her movements around the principle that following required a destination she had verified independently, a direction she had evaluated and approved, a trust she had established through process rather than instinct. She was following this man off a stage she had not expected to leave with her dignity intact, and she had not verified anything, and the instinct was the only instrument she had available, and she had apparently decided to trust it, which was either wisdom or the particular category of decision-making that only becomes possible when everything else has been temporarily suspended by something more immediate. He stopped at the edge of the room, near the tall windows that looked out over the lit city. He turned to face her. He was close enough now that the stage distance was gone, that she could see the particular quality of his face without the mediation of lights and distance, and it was, she thought, a face that had never been designed for comfort, not in the way of ugliness, but in the way of something that communicated simply through its composition that its primary function was not the performance of approachability. It was a face that had arrived at its current configuration through a specific accumulation of decisions and had not apologized for any of them. He said, "Kang Min-jun." He offered his name the way he had offered the microphone, with the directness of someone who understood that the transfer of information was a form of trust and who did not offer trust performatively. She said, "I know who you are." She said it before she had decided to say it, which was the kind of thing that happened when the internal editor had been temporarily overridden by the events of the last 10 minutes. She said, "Everyone in that room knows who you are." He said, "And?" She said, "And I do not know why you did that." He looked at her. He said, "Because it needed to be done." She said, "That is not an explanation." He said, "No." He agreed with the same quality of voice he used for everything, level and unhurried. "It is the beginning of one." He looked at her for a moment.
If you want the rest of it, I will give it to you, but not here." She looked at the room. She could see Cha Junho at the table near the stage, his professional composure reinstalled, his expression managing the evening with the practiced skill of a man who understood that the only way forward from a public diminishment of that scale was to perform indifference so completely that the performance became a kind of dignity. She could see Lee Dong-u at their table, leaning toward the woman on their right with the slightly too animated quality of someone narrating an event he had witnessed to an audience who had also witnessed it, converting proximity to significance. She could see her mother, who was seated 2 tables back, who was holding her water glass with both hands and looking at Yuna with an expression she had not seen her mother wear before, which was an expression that contained no advice, that was simply watching.
She turned back to Kang Min-jun. She said, "The rest of it, what does that mean?" He said, "It means I are not finished speaking to you tonight." He said it without inflection, as information, the way he said everything, and the absence of ornamentation made it more direct than ornamentation would have, made it land as the plain thing it was rather than the performance of a plain thing. She said, "You were very certain for a man who spoke to me for the first time 3 minutes ago." He said, "I spoke to you for the first time 3 minutes ago. I have not been unaware of you for 3 minutes." The city moved below the glass. Someone in the room behind them laughed at something, the natural laughter of an event resuming its rhythm after an interruption, the sound of 300 people deciding to continue with the evening. She held the trophy. She thought about what he had said and what it meant and what the architecture of it was. This statement of prior awareness, this suggestion that the evening was not an origin but a convergence, that she had been somewhere in his peripheral knowledge before tonight, and that tonight had moved her from the periphery to the center of something she did not have the full map for. She said, "Tell me what you mean by that." He said, "Not here." He said it again, with the same patience, and she understood that the patience was not dismissal, was not the postponement of someone who intended to avoid the subject, but was the patience of someone who understood that certain conversations required a different kind of space than the 4th floor of a tower where 300 people were still processing an evening that had already exceeded its program. He said, "Will you come with me?" She said, "You have given me no reason to." He said, "You are holding the trophy. I think that is a reason." She looked at the trophy. She thought about what it had cost to be in that room, to have walked up those stairs, to have stood on that stage while the room made its decision about her. She thought about the 4 years of the work, of the neighborhoods and the consulting fee she had deferred, and the 2 investors, and the slow accumulation of something real. And she thought about the fact that this man had stood up from the first row and climbed the stairs and taken the microphone and said in a room full of people the thing that had needed to be said, simply, without making a production of it, without making it about himself, and that he had done it with the same quality of unhurried certainty that characterized every other thing he had done in her presence. She said, "One conversation." She said it the way she made commitments, with the full of herself and the precise limits she intended. "One conversation, where you tell me what you meant. After that, I decide." He said, "Yes." They left the room together. Behind them, the Seoul Young Innovators Gala continued. The string quartet that had been on break returned to their corner. The dessert course was served. Someone gave a speech about innovation in the future that ran 4 minutes over the allotted time and was received with the patient applause of an audience that had already experienced the most interesting thing the evening had to offer and was completing the formalities with a mild and collective grace. Cha Jun-ho finished the program with the professional composure of a man who had decided that the most powerful thing he could do was pretend that the preceding 40 minutes had been exactly as he had planned them. No one who had been in the room believed him. Everyone had the courtesy to act as though they did. The night outside was cold in the way of Seoul in late autumn, the specific cold of a city that does not soften its weather for the convenience of people who have not dressed for it. Yuna had not dressed for it. She had dressed for an air-conditioned event space and a subway car and the particular calculation of a woman who had expected to spend the evening managing her positioning relative to known hazards and going home the same size she had arrived. She was not the same size she had arrived. Something about the evening had expanded her, not in the way of addition, but in the way of a pressure releasing, the way a room feels larger when something that was taking up too much space in it is removed. He gave her his jacket before she asked for it. She noticed the before. She put it on. They walked. The city was itself at this hour, loud and lit and moving with the specific energy of a place that had never fully agreed to stop, and she was in it differently than she had been in it before.
Or the same and simply more aware of the difference, walking beside a man whose name she had known in the abstract and whose presence she was now knowing in the concrete, which were, she was finding, very different categories of knowledge. She said, 2 years? He said, yes. She said, you have been watching my company for 2 years. She had made the calculation quickly, the way she made all calculations, and she was presenting the result as a fact rather than a question, because it was a fact. I want to know what that means. He looked ahead at the street, and she watched his profile in the ambient light of the city, the particular quality of a face that had learned to reveal only what it chose to reveal, and that was choosing, at this moment, to be honest. He said, your work intersects with areas that certain organizations consider useful territory, not for the same reasons you consider them useful. He said it without euphemism. She appreciated the absence of euphemism. She had spent enough of her life on the receiving end of language that was constructed to be understood at one level while operating at another, and she had developed a preference for the plain version, even when the plain version was harder. She said, organizations meaning yours? He said, not mine, others. Mine is the reason those others were not a problem for you. She stopped walking. He stopped a step later, turned to face her. She looked at him in the streetlight and felt the information arriving in the specific way that significant information arrived, not all at once but in expanding rings, the immediate understanding followed by the secondary implication, followed by the tertiary, each one opening into a wider understanding of what had been happening around her life for 2 years without her knowledge or consent. She said, you protected my company. He said, yes. She said, without telling me? He said, yes. She said, so when I thought I was building something independently, when I made every decision based on the belief that what I was building was mine, entirely mine, that belief was... She stopped. She did not have the word she wanted. The word she wanted was something between incomplete and violated, something that acknowledged both the gift and the removal of her agency in the receiving of it. He said, real. The word arrived before she finished the sentence. What you built is real. What you did is real. I removed one category of obstacle. The rest was you. He said it with the same quality of voice, but something had shifted in it, something that was not quite the absence of the controlled certainty, but was the controlled certainty making room for something else, something that had the quality of a man accounting for something that mattered to him. He said, I want you to understand that. I know that what I did was without your knowledge. I know that is a problem. I am not telling you it is not. I am telling you that the work is real, and that the people whose lives are different because of it are not the result of my intervention. They are the result of yours. She stood in the cold with his jacket around her and the trophy in her hand, and the city moving past them with its characteristic indifference to the specific gravity of individual moments, and she thought about the 4 years, about the 11 months of deferred salary and the 2 investors and the neighborhoods and the slow accumulation of something real, and she thought about this man who had apparently been somewhere at the edge of all of it, holding back things she had not known needed to be held back, and she tried to locate the exact emotion that was most accurate to the situation, and found, as she often found when she was most honest with herself, that there was more than one and that they were not fully compatible. She said, I am angry. He said, I know. She said, I am angry that you made a decision about my life without consulting me, that you decided I needed protection and provided it and considered that sufficient, that for 2 years I operated inside a safety I did not know existed and that I would have wanted to know about, not because I needed it to feel grateful, but because I deserved to know the full conditions of my own situation. She said it evenly. She was not raising her voice. She had learned in the years of building something that the most effective version of her position was the version that did not require volume, that the argument was stronger without the emotion attached to it, and she was making the argument. He said, yes. He said it simply, without defense, without the instinct to redirect that she had encountered in most men who received criticism, without the construction of the alternate narrative. He said, you are right. I made the decision. I have thought in the years since about whether I would make it again, and the honest answer is that I would, because the alternative was allowing harm to reach something that did not deserve harm, but I would make it differently. I would have found a way to tell you. I did not because I did not want to be known to you at the time. He paused. That was a choice that prioritized my own preferences over your right to information about your own life, and I am aware that it was not the right choice.